The summer of 1815 had been the season of Isadora Fairchild's greatest hopes and deepest humiliation. At 22 years of age, Miss Isadora Eleanor Fairchild, only daughter of the late Baron Fairchild of Somerset, had entered the London social world with modest expectations. Her father's estate had been comfortable but not lavish. Her dowry was respectable but not remarkable, a sum of £8,000 and a small property in the countryside that brought in perhaps 300 a year. She possessed what her aunt called understated beauty, rich auburn hair that gleamed like burnished copper in candlelight, expressive hazel eyes that shifted from green to gold depending on her mood, and a natural grace that came from genuine warmth rather than rehearsed artifice. She had not expected to capture the attention of Charles Edmund Blackwood, second son of the Earl of Pemberton, one of the most charming gentlemen in London society. Yet he had pursued her with an intensity that had set drawing-rooms buzzing from Mayfair to Bloomsbury. He had claimed the first 2 dances at Lady Harrington's ball, scandalously close to a declaration. He had driven her through Hyde Park in his gleaming phaeton, doffing his hat to every passer-by as though displaying a prize. He had engaged her in conversations about literature and music that stretched into entire afternoons, his attention so focused she felt like the only woman in England. He had made her believe, foolish, naive girl that she was, that he saw something in her beyond her modest social position. "You have such depth, Miss Fairchild," he had told her one golden afternoon in her mother's drawing-room, his grey-blue eyes luminous with what she'd mistaken for sincerity. "So many young ladies concern themselves only with the latest fashions and the most trivial gossip. You are different. You are rare." She had allowed herself to hope, to dream, to imagine a future as Mrs. Charles Blackwood, not for his connections or his family's prominence, but because she had genuinely, desperately believed Charles cared for her. Then Miss Harriet Weatherby had descended upon London like a golden comet. The daughter of shipping magnate Sir Edmund Weatherby, who had purchased his baronetcy with industrial fortune, Harriet brought with her a dowry of £30,000 and her father's ruthless ambition to see her married into the highest echelons of society. She was beautiful in the conventional, devastating way, golden ringlets that bounced with calculated charm, cornflower blue eyes wide with practiced innocence, and a figure that drew admiring stares from every gentleman who entered a room. Isadora had watched Charles's attention shift with the speed and inevitability of a guillotine blade falling. Within a week, he was dancing to Miss Weatherby at every social function. Within a fortnight, he was calling at the Weatherby residence daily, his phaeton conspicuously absent from Hyde Park except when Harriet sat beside him. Within 3 weeks, the whispers had begun, pitying glances cast toward Isadora, knowing smiles exchanged behind fans, the subtle social cruelty of a woman being publicly replaced. And then came Mrs. Pemberton's garden party, one of the most anticipated events of the late summer season. Isadora had arrived with hope still flickering stubbornly in her chest. Surely Charles would explain. Surely there was some misunderstanding. Surely the man who had spoken to her of depth and rarity wouldn't simply abandon her. She spotted him across the manicured lawn, his fair hair catching the afternoon sunlight like a halo, and her heart performed its usual traitorous leap. She had worn her finest dress, the pale blue muslin with the delicate embroidered hem, the one he'd once said made her eyes look like sea glass. Because tonight, the persistent whispers insisted, tonight he would make his intentions clear. But Charles was not alone. Miss Weatherby clung to his arm like an ornamental vine, laughing at something he'd said, her ringlets bouncing, her expression one of smug triumph. As Isadora approached, confused, hopeful, desperately trying to understand, Charles turned. His smile was all polished edges and calculated cruelty. It never touched his eyes. "Ah, Miss Fairchild," he said, his voice carrying across the garden with the clarity of a town crier, pitched deliberately for the maximum number of witnesses. "Perfect timing. How fortuitous!" He paused, allowing the assembled guests to fall silent, to turn and watch. "I wanted you to be among the first to meet my fiancée, Miss Harriet Weatherby. Daughter of Sir Edmund Weatherby, you understand. 30,000 a year." The words landed like physical blows. He continued, each syllable a precisely aimed dagger. "I do hope I didn't mislead you these past months, Miss Fairchild. You were such pleasant company, truly delightful conversation. But surely you understood." Here his expression shifted to something worse than hatred, something closer to pity laced with contempt. "A man in my position must think strategically about his future. One must be practical about advancement. You've been a charming diversion, nothing more." The garden tilted on its axis. Isadora heard the collective intake of breath, the rustle of silk and muslin as every woman within earshot turned to witness her humiliation. She heard the whispers starting immediately, spreading like wildfire through the crowd. "Did you hear what he said? A diversion. How mortifying. Poor girl, she actually thought he was serious." Charles's new fiancée, her replacement, smirked behind her fan, her blue eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. The shame was total, absolute. It painted Isadora's skin crimson from her throat to her hairline. It closed her throat around words that wouldn't form, protests that died unuttered. Her vision blurred at the edges. Her hands, clutching her reticule, trembled visibly. A charming diversion. She would replay those words in her mind for 3 years. She would hear them in quiet moments, in the dark before sleep, in every pitying glance she received at subsequent social gatherings. They became the refrain of her existence. You were never meant to matter. You were always expendable. But at that moment, with half of London society watching, Isadora Eleanor Fairchild did the only thing she could do. She lifted her chin. She forced her spine straight. She met Charles's gaze with every ounce of dignity she possessed, though it felt like trying to hold water in her bare hands. "I wish you every happiness, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice somehow steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. "Miss Weatherby is fortunate indeed." Then she turned and walked away, not running, never running, her head high and her heart shattered into pieces so small she wondered if they could ever be reassembled. 3 years later, at 25 years of age, Isadora Fairchild had learned the most valuable and bitter lesson of her life. Never trust pretty words. Never believe tender gestures. Never allow yourself to hope. Men like Charles Edmund Blackwood collected hearts like trophies and discarded women like used handkerchiefs. Women like her, without spectacular beauty, without impressive dowries, without powerful family connections, were always expendable. She had rebuilt herself on this foundation of cynicism. She had accepted her fate as a spinster, a cautionary tale, a woman who had reached for something beyond her station and been publicly punished for her presumption. Which is precisely why, when the most powerful duke in all of England appeared in her mother's drawing room and offered her a marriage devoid of love, romance, or any pretense of affection, a cold, practical arrangement between two people who wanted nothing from each other except convenience, Isadora Eleanor Fairchild looked into his ice-gray eyes and said yes without a moment's hesitation. She had learned her lesson about love. She would never be so foolish again. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel so others can discover and enjoy more Victorian-era romance stories like this from this same channel. Chapter 1. 3 years had transformed Isadora Fairchild from a young woman of hope into a specter haunting the edges of ballrooms. At 25, she had crossed that invisible but immutable line in society, the demarcation between marriageable miss and confirmed spinster. The shift had been gradual but inexorable, like watching the tide recede and knowing it would not return. Invitations still arrived, but they came addressed to Miss Fairchild and chaperone, rather than to her alone. Hostesses seated her with the widows and the aging aunts rather than among the eligible young ladies. Gentlemen's eyes slid past her, as though she were part of the wallpaper. She had become invisible. Her days had settled into a rhythm of quiet resignation. She lived with her mother in the modest townhouse in Bloomsbury, her father having passed 2 years prior, leaving them comfortable but not wealthy. She managed the household accounts with meticulous care, stretching their reduced income to maintain appearances. She accompanied her mother on social calls, poured tea for visitors, and embroidered cushion covers that no one would ever admire. The spark that Charles had once praised, that depth, that rarity, had been carefully, deliberately extinguished. It was safer this way. Expectation led only to disappointment. Hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. The pitying looks were the worst part. She saw them everywhere, in the way Lady Harrington's daughter averted her eyes when Isadora entered a room, and the overly bright-toned elderly matrons used when speaking to her, as though she were a child or an invalid. She had become a cautionary tale whispered to debutantes. See what happens when you aim above your station? That could be you in 3 years, gathering dust in the corner. The evening at the Theatre Royal had cemented her erasure with devastating finality. She'd accompanied her mother to see a performance of The Rivals, seated in the second tier where respectability met economy. During the interval, she'd glanced down into the box circle and seen him, Charles Edmund Blackwood, his golden hair still catching the light, his posture still radiating the careless confidence of a man who had never faced consequences for his cruelty. His wife sat beside him, Harriet Weatherby, now Mrs. Blackwood. She looked bored and expensive, dripping with jewels that £30,000 could buy. A small child, a son, presumably, squirmed on her lap. Charles had built his life exactly as he'd planned. Isadora was merely a footnote he'd long forgotten. As if summoned by her gaze, Charles had looked up. His eyes passed directly over her, a sweep of assessment that found nothing worth acknowledging. No flash of recognition. No flicker of memory. No trace of guilt. He looked at her the way one might look at an empty chair. Then he turned back to his wife, said something that made her laugh, and Isadora Fairchild understood with crystalline clarity. She had not merely been rejected. She had been erased. In Charles's memory, she had never mattered enough to remember. That night, lying in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, Isadora made her peace with her future. She would never marry. She would never matter to anyone beyond her small domestic sphere. She would fade quietly into the comfortable obscurity of maiden aunts everywhere. It was enough. It had to be enough. She had no other choice. Chapter 2. Lucian Theodore Ravenscourt, 7th Duke of Ravenscourt, had learned long ago that being England's most eligible bachelor was less a privilege and more a persistent affliction. At 37, he possessed everything society deemed valuable: ancient title, vast wealth, political influence that extended to the highest corridors of power, and, according to the relentless marriage-minded matrons of the town, a face and form that made debutantes blush and stammer. His hair was dark as midnight, his eyes a piercing gray that missed nothing, and his presence commanded rooms with the effortless authority of a man born to rule. He wanted none of the attention it brought him. 20 years earlier, at 17, and still possessed of foolish romantic notions, he had fallen desperately in love with Lady Caroline Winters. She had seemed to return his affection with equal fervor, until the day after their engagement was announced, when he discovered her in the garden house with his own cousin, their passion as theatrical as it was genuine. She'd wanted the title, not the man. The humiliation had carved something essential out of him, leaving only pragmatism and caution in its wake. Now, 2 decades later, he found himself in the tiresome position of needing a wife. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, had been increasingly vocal about the need for an heir. His political allies suggested that a married duke carried more gravitas in Parliament. And the fortune-hunting mothers had reached such a fever pitch that he could barely attend a social function without being cornered by some simpering girl who giggled at everything he said and looked at him like he was a prize to be won. He needed a wife who would be practical. Someone who understood that this was a transaction, not a romance. Someone who wouldn't expect declarations of love or romantic gestures. Someone who had already relinquished foolish dreams. He found her quite by accident at Lady Thornbury's musical evening. Lucian had attended only because the Prime Minister would be present, and certain political matters required informal discussion. He'd positioned himself near the back of the music room, prepared to endure an hour of indifferent pianoforte and worse singing, when his attention snagged on a woman seated alone near the window. She was neither young nor fashionable by society's exacting standards. Perhaps 25, dressed in a gown of dove gray that suggested mourning not quite relinquished. Her hair, a rich auburn that caught the lamplight, was arranged simply, without the elaborate curls currently in vogue. She sat with perfect posture, hands folded in her lap, her expression one of polite attention that didn't quite reach her eyes. What struck him most was her complete stillness. While other young women whispered and giggled, cast flirtatious glances at eligible gentlemen, or pretended for attention, this woman simply existed. She appeared neither eager to be noticed nor distressed by being overlooked. She was an island of calm resignation in a sea of desperate ambition. Perfect. Lucian made discreet inquiries. Miss Isadora Fairchild, only daughter of the late Baron Fairchild. Modest means, modest connections, modest prospects. And, this intrigued him most, a history of public humiliation at the hands of Charles Blackwood, that preening social climber who'd married a fortune and spawned an heir. A woman who had learned that love was an illusion. A woman who would understand a practical arrangement. A woman who would ask nothing of his heart because hers was already closed. By the time the musical concluded, Lucian had made his decision. He would propose a marriage of pure convenience, and Miss Isadora Fairchild would accept. Chapter 3. The Duke of Ravenscourt's card arrived 3 days after the musical, requesting a private audience with Miss Fairchild and her mother at their earliest convenience. Isadora's mother had nearly fainted. The Duke of Ravenscourt, one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in England, calling upon them. It was unprecedented. Incomprehensible. There must be some mistake. But there was no mistake. At precisely 3 o'clock the following afternoon, His Grace arrived in a carriage so magnificent it made their modest Bloomsbury Street look shabby by comparison. He entered their small drawing-room and somehow made it feel smaller still, not through arrogance, but through sheer presence. He was taller than Isadora remembered from glimpsing him across ballrooms, his dark hair silvered slightly at the temples, his great eyes assessing everything with unsettling intelligence. He declined tea. He declined pleasantries. He sat in the chair her mother indicated with the controlled grace of a man accustomed to command, and then he spoke with a directness that stole the breath from Isadora's lungs. "Miss Fairchild, I require a wife. You require security and social rehabilitation. I believe we can be of mutual service to one another." Her mother made a small, shocked sound. Isadora sat frozen, unable to process what she was hearing. Lucian continued, his tone as businesslike as if he were negotiating a trade agreement. "I do not offer love, Miss Fairchild, nor do I expect it. Love is a fiction perpetuated by poets and fools, and I am neither. What I offer is this: marriage, financial security, social elevation to the highest rank, autonomy over my households, and my protection from the society that has diminished you. In exchange, I require a duchess who can manage my estates, appear at my side for official functions, and refrain from complicating my life with emotional expectations." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze holding hers with uncomfortable intensity. I have observed you, Miss Fairchild. You are composed, intelligent, and most importantly, you have already relinquished romantic illusions. You understand that marriage is a practical arrangement, not a fairy tale. This makes you uniquely suited to my requirements. Isadora found her voice, though it emerged shakier than she'd intended. Your Grace, this is highly irregular. It is honest, he corrected. I will not court you with false promises. I will not pretend affection I do not feel. But I will respect you, protect you, and ensure you want nothing material. You will be the Duchess of Ravenscourt, second only to royalty in rank. Society will bow to you instead of pitying you. The words hung in the air like a benediction and a devil's bargain combined. Her mother began, Your Grace, surely my daughter requires time to consider. I accept, Isadora said. The words emerged with startling clarity, surprising even herself. But as she spoke to them, she felt a strange sense of rightness settle over her. This was not love. This would never be love. But it was honest, and it was an escape from the slow death of spinsterhood. Lucien's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those gray eyes. Approval, perhaps, or satisfaction. We can be married within the week. My solicitor will draw up settlements. You will have an independent income and full authority over household matters. What other terms do you require? They negotiated like merchants at market, her mother hovering in scandalized silence while Isadora and the Duke discussed practicalities with the emotional investment of strangers arranging a business merger. By the time he left, Isadora was engaged to be married. She felt nothing. And somehow, that felt exactly right. Chapter 4. The wedding took place 6 days later in the private chapel at Ravenscourt Hall, the Duke's principal estate in Derbyshire. It was nothing like the ceremony Isadora had once imagined in her foolish youth. There were no flowers adorning the pews, no guests filling the ancient stone chapel with warmth and celebration, no music swelling with romantic promise. Just the elderly vicar, 2 servants as witnesses, her bewildered mother dabbing at tears that seemed born more of shock than joy, and the Duke himself, immaculate in dark superfine, his expression as readable as granite. Isadora wore a simple gown of ivory silk, elegant but unadorned. No veil. No orange blossoms. No pretense that this was anything other than what it was. A legal transaction between 2 people who had agreed to mutual convenience. The vicar's words washed over her like distant thunder. She heard herself speak the vows. I, Isadora Eleanor, take thee, Lucien Theodore, and wondered distantly if she was making the greatest mistake of her life or the most pragmatic decision. Perhaps both could be true simultaneously. When Lucien slid the heavy gold ring onto her finger, an heirloom bearing the Ravenscourt crest, his hands were steady. Hers trembled slightly. His gray eyes met hers for a brief moment, and she saw nothing in them, no affection, no regret, no triumph. Just acknowledgment that a contract had been sealed. You may kiss the bride, the vicar said, his tone uncertain, as though sensing the strange coldness of the proceedings. Lucien leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers with the brief, formal pressure of a diplomatic gesture. It was over in seconds. Isadora felt nothing except the faint warmth of his breath and the disturbing realization that this man was now her husband. The wedding breakfast was equally austere. Afterwards, Lucien excused himself to attend to estate business, and Isadora was shown to her chambers, a magnificent suite of rooms decorated in shades of cream and gold, connecting to the Duke's apartments through a door that remained firmly closed. The housekeeper, Mrs. Daventry, appeared that evening with awkward gentleness. "His Grace wishes you to know that he respects your privacy absolutely, your Grace. He will not impose upon you. Unless, of course, the matter of an heir becomes necessary, in which case he will give you advance notice." Isadora nodded, mortification heating her cheeks. Even this most intimate aspect of marriage had been reduced to a practical arrangement requiring advanced scheduling. The first week passed in a blur of overwhelming instruction. Mrs. Daventry guided her through the labyrinthine responsibilities of managing a ducal household, reviewing menus, approving expenditures, overseeing a staff of 40 servants, learning the complex hierarchy of the estate. There were 3 properties to manage, correspondence to supervise, charitable obligations to fulfill, social expectations to navigate. Lucien appeared at dinner each evening, impeccably dressed and unfailingly polite. They discussed household matters, political developments, and the weather. He complimented her handling of a dispute between the cook and the scullery maid. He asked if her rooms were comfortable. He treated her exactly as one might treat a competent estate manager who happened to share his table. Never once did he ask how she felt. Never once did he offer anything beyond formal courtesy. At night, alone in her vast, beautiful bed, Isadora stared at the canopy above and wondered if she had simply traded one form of invisibility for another. She was no longer a pitted spinster. She was now a duchess in name only, elevated in rank, but still fundamentally alone, married to a man who saw her as a solution to a problem rather than a person worth knowing. She had wanted to escape from loneliness. Instead, she'd found a more elegant cage. Chapter 5. For days after becoming the Duchess of Ravenscourt, Isadora was informed they would attend the Marquis of Ashford's autumn ball that evening. The terror was immediate and visceral. She would be walking into a room full of people who had watched her humiliation 3 years prior, who had whispered about her decline into spinsterhood, who had pitied her, or mocked her, or simply forgotten her existence. Now she would enter as a duchess, the highest-ranking woman present, and they would all know it was a marriage of convenience. They would speculate, gossip, dissect every detail. She could barely breathe at the thought. Her lady's maid dressed her in a gown of deep emerald silk that transformed her auburn hair into burnished copper and made her hazel eyes glow like jewels. Then Mrs. Daventry arrived carrying a velvet case that made the maid gasp audibly. The Ravenscourt diamonds. The parure was legendary. A necklace of stones so large and perfectly matched they seemed to capture and refract every light source in the room, with matching earrings and bracelet. Isadora stared at them, overwhelmed. His Grace insists, Your Grace, Mrs. Daventry said quietly. He said society must understand exactly who you are now. When Isadora descended the staircase, Lucian was waiting in the entrance hall, devastatingly handsome in black evening clothes. His eyes traveled over her, the gown, the diamonds, her carefully arranged hair, and for the first time since their wedding, his expression shifted into something almost like approval. You look every inch a duchess, he said simply. In the carriage, her hands trembled in her lap. She tried to control it, but the fear was too overwhelming. She was returning to the world that had watched her fall, now wearing another woman's diamonds and another woman's title, married to a man who felt nothing for her. Lucian's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. You are afraid. It wasn't a question. She couldn't deny it. They will whisper, she managed. They will judge. They all remember. Let them whisper, he said, his tone carrying an edge of steel she'd never heard before. You are the Duchess of Ravenscourt now. You outrank every woman in that ballroom, and most of the men. They will bow to you, or they will answer to me. She looked at him, startled by the protective authority in his voice. His gray eyes held hers in the dimness of the carriage. You are under my protection now, Isadora. That means something. They arrived fashionably late, as was the Duke's prerogative. The footman announced them at the ballroom entrance. His Grace the Duke of Ravenscourt, and Her Grace the Duchess of Ravenscourt. The ballroom fell silent. Every head turned. Every eye fixed upon them. Isadora's vision narrowed. Her breath caught. The weight of hundreds of stairs pressed down on her like a physical force. She felt herself beginning to freeze, to panic. And then Lucian's hand settled at the small of her back. Warm, steady, unmovable. Walk, he murmured, too low for anyone else to hear. Head high. You are mine now. They cannot touch you. She walked, and somehow, with his hand anchoring her, she didn't fall. Chapter 6. The first hour passed in a haze of formal introductions and carefully choreographed courtesy. Ladies curtsied deeply to Isadora. Women who had once looked through her now bowing their heads in deference. Gentlemen bowed. Hostesses fawned. The Marquis of Ashford himself had greeted them with effusive warmth, clearly delighted that the Duke had graced his ball with his legendary presence. Isadora played her part with mechanical precision, smile fixed, responses polite, the Ravenscourt diamonds glittering at her throat like armor. Then the Prime Minister arrived, and Lucian was pulled away into a cluster of dark-suited men near the card room. Political matters that couldn't wait, apparently. He glanced at her, a question in his eyes, and she nodded. She could manage alone. She was a duchess now. She'd positioned herself near the terrace doors, where the air was cooler, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing footman, simply to have something to do with her hands. Around her, the tons swirled in their elaborate dances of social maneuvering. She was watching the dancers, trying to appear composed rather than abandoned, when she heard a voice that turned her blood to ice. Good God! Is that Miss Fairchild? Charles Edmund Blackwood materialized beside her, his fair hair slightly disheveled, his cravat loosened, his cheeks flushed with too much champagne. He looked older than she remembered, softer around the middle, harder around the eyes. His gaze swept over her with the casual dismissiveness of a man who had never considered her worth remembering. He clearly didn't recognize the diamonds, didn't understand what they signified. "Still single, are you?" he said, his voice carrying across the nearby guests with that same calculated projection he'd used at the garden party 3 years ago. Several heads turned. Conversations faltered. "What a pity! I suppose some women simply aren't meant for marriage." He smiled, that same cruel, pitying smile that still haunted her nightmares. "Though I must say, you're looking well enough. Spinsterhood seems to agree with you. Or perhaps you've simply accepted your fate with grace? That's admirable, truly. Not every woman can manage such dignity in the face of disappointment." The surrounding guests gasped audibly. Fans snapped open. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Isadora froze. Every carefully constructed wall she had built over 3 years crumbled in an instant. She was 22 again, standing in Mrs. Pemberton's garden, hearing herself called a charming diversion, while society watched and judged. The shame flooded back with suffocating intensity. The humiliation, the helplessness, the crushing knowledge that she was expendable, forgettable, worth nothing. Her champagne glass trembled in her hand. Her throat closed. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't think beyond the roaring in her ears and the terrible familiar burn of tears threatening behind her eyes. Charles was still talking, his words blurring together, something about limited prospects and realistic expectations, his tone dripping with false sympathy and genuine contempt. The ballroom seemed to tilt on its axis. And then, cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk, a voice spoke from directly behind her, cold, controlled, and absolutely lethal. "You are mistaken, Blackwood." Lucian. Chapter 7. The Duke of Ravenscourt moved through the crowd with the fluid, unhurried grace of a predator who had already identified his prey. The sea of guests parted instinctively before him, recognizing danger in the set of his shoulders, the ice in his gray eyes. He came to stand directly beside Isadora, so close she could feel the heat radiating from him, and slid his arm around her waist with unmistakable possession. The touch burned through the silk of her gown, anchoring her when she felt herself drowning. "You are mistaken, Blackwood," Lucian said, his voice carrying across the now silent ballroom with the absolute authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You are addressing my wife, Her Grace, the Duchess of Ravenscourt." The ballroom erupted. Gasps ricocheted off the chandeliers. Fans fluttered frantically. Whispers exploded into urgent hisses of shock and speculation. Every eye fixed on the tableau. Charles Blackwood, frozen in horror. Isadora, trembling beneath the Duke's protective arm. And Lucian himself, radiating cold fury barely leashed. Charles's face drained of all color. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping on dry land. Lucian continued with devastating calm, each word precisely chosen and brutally delivered. I confess myself surprised, Blackwood, that you would approach a Duchess of the realm with such familiar disrespect. Though perhaps I should not be surprised. Your judgment has always been questionable. He paused, allowing the words to land, then continued with surgical precision. Let me remind those present of the facts, since Mr. Blackwood seems confused about the social hierarchy. He is the second son of an earl, possessed of no independent fortune and no particular accomplishment. His marriage to Miss Weatherby, now Mrs. Blackwood, was achieved solely through the £30,000 her merchant father paid to elevate his daughter's station. Without that dowry, Mr. Blackwood would be precisely what he was before, a gentleman of no consequence whatsoever. Charles made a strangled sound. His wife, standing nearby, looked ready to faint. Furthermore, Lucian said, his voice dropping to something even more dangerous, I have heard disturbing rumors about your treatment of young ladies during your courtship of Miss Weatherby. Public humiliations, casual cruelties, the behavior of a man who mistakes meanness for wit and cruelty for charm. The silence was absolute now. No one dared breathe. My wife, Lucian continued, drawing Isidora closer against his side, outranks you by several orders of magnitude, Blackwood. She outranks your wife. She outranks nearly everyone in this ballroom. And she is under my protection, which means an insult to her is an insult to me personally. He let that thread hang in the air for a long, terrible moment. You will apologize to the Duchess. Now! Charles's face had gone from white to mottled red. His hands trembled. He looked desperately around the ballroom for support and found only avid, hungry stares waiting to see him destroyed. I apologize, Your Grace, he stammered, the words barely audible. I meant no disrespect. I didn't realize. You didn't realize she mattered, Lucian finished coldly. Yes, that much is evident. He dismissed Charles with a look of such aristocratic disdain that several people actually stepped back. Then, without another word to the humiliated man, Lucian turned to Isidora. Dance with me, he said quietly. Not a request. A claim. He led her onto the floor as the orchestra, sensing the moment, began a waltz. His arm circled her waist. His hand captured hers. And as they moved together before hundreds of watching eyes, Isidora realized something that stole her breath more effectively than Charles's cruelty ever had. Lucian had defended her. Not out of duty. Not for appearance. He had been genuinely, furiously angry on her behalf. Chapter 8. The waltz ended to thunderous applause that felt less like appreciation for the dance and more like society's collective acknowledgement of a public claim. Lucian didn't release her immediately. His hand remained at her waist for a fraction longer than necessary, his gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. You need air, he said quietly. Not a question. An observation. He guided her through the crowd, which parted instantly before them, toward the terrace doors. Outside, the autumn night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the dark sky like the diamonds at her throat. The sounds of the ballroom faded to a distant murmur. Isadora's hands were shaking. Now that the immediate shock had passed, reaction was setting in. She gripped the stone balustrade to steady herself, gulping air that suddenly seemed insufficient. "Thank you," she managed, her voice unsteady. "I thank you. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. And you? He will never approach you again," Lucian said flatly. "I'll ensure it." She turned to look at him. In the moonlight, his features were all sharp angles and shadows, his expression unreadable. But there was something in the set of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders, that spoke of fury not yet fully spent. "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "Why did you defend me so fiercely? Our arrangement is practical. You said so yourself. You owe me nothing beyond the terms we agreed upon." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he moved closer, close enough that she could see the subtle flecks of silver in his gray eyes, close enough that she caught the scent of his cologne, something dark and expensive. "I will not tolerate anyone treating you with disrespect," he said quietly. "You are mine to protect now. That means something to me, even if it was not part of our original negotiation." "But why?" she pressed, her voice barely a whisper. "You chose me precisely because I wouldn't complicate your life. Because I understood this was business, not... Not what?" His voice was low, almost dangerous. "Not a real marriage?" The air between them felt charged, electric. Isadora's heart hammered against her ribs. Lucian looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time since their wedding. Not assessing her utility or her appearance, but seeing her. The woman who had been humiliated and rebuilt herself with dignity. The woman who had accepted his cold proposal without flinching. The woman who now stood before him wearing his family's diamonds and trembling from both fear and something else she couldn't name. "Perhaps," he said slowly, each word weighted with meaning, "I'm beginning to think practical is insufficient." The words hung between them like a confession. Isadora couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The walls she'd built so carefully around her heart, the same walls that had made her perfect for his requirements, suddenly felt dangerously fragile. "Lucian," she whispered, using his given name for the first time. Something flickered in his eyes. Something warm and alive and utterly unexpected. They stood in charged silence, the distant music drifting through the terrace doors, the moonlight painting everything silver. Neither moved. Neither spoke. But something fundamental had shifted between them, a crack appearing in both their carefully constructed armors. Inside the ballroom, society would be dissecting what they'd witnessed. But out here, in the quiet darkness, two people who had married for convenience discovered the terrifying possibility of something far more dangerous. Something real. Chapter 9. The week following the Ashford ball transformed Isadora's understanding of what her marriage could become. She had expected to navigate society alone, performing her duties as Duchess, while Lucian returned to his previous pattern of distance and formality. Instead, he accompanied her to morning calls, attended charitable functions he'd previously avoided, and appeared at her side during Lady Castlereagh's interminable tea with a frequency that set tongues wagging. More surprising still was the way he engaged with her. Not as a convenient arrangement to be managed, but as a partner whose opinions he genuinely sought. During a discussion of estate improvements, he asked her thoughts on tenant housing and actually listened, implementing her suggestions the following day. When she expressed interest in expanding the charity school on the Derbyshire property, he didn't dismiss it as women's frivolity. He arranged meetings with architects. Society noticed. How could they not? The Duke of Ravenscourt, that bastion of cold pragmatism, hovering protectively near his new Duchess, his hand finding the small of her back in crowded rooms, his gray eyes tracking her movements with an attentiveness that felt almost possessive. On the 6th day, he summoned her to his study. Isidora entered to find him standing before the massive desk, a large mahogany case resting on its surface. Her heart stuttered at the intensity of his gaze. "I've been remiss," he said without preamble. "You've worn the diamonds because they establish your rank. But the rest of the Ravenscourt collection belongs to you by right." He opened the case, revealing jewelry that made her breath catch, emeralds, sapphires, rubies, pearls, each piece more magnificent than the last. Generations of accumulated treasure, the material legacy of every duchess who had come before. "These aren't loans, Isidora. They're yours. Not because you fulfilled some obligation, but because you are the Duchess." He paused, his voice dropping to something raw and honest. "My Duchess. And I need you to understand, you are not a commodity I've acquired. You are not a convenient solution to an inconvenient problem." He moved closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "You are my wife. And somewhere between that ballroom and this moment, that began to mean something I didn't anticipate." That evening, they shared dinner alone for the first time since their wedding. No formal silence. No awkward courtesy. Instead, conversation flowed with surprising ease. Books they'd read, places they'd traveled, childhood memories that revealed the people they'd been before life had taught them to guard their hearts. Isidora watched him across the candlelight, this man who had proposed a marriage of pure convenience, and felt something dangerous and wonderful unfurling in her chest. Something that felt terrifyingly like hope, like trust, like the tentative beginning of love. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer that broken girl in the garden, dismissed as expendable. She was the Duchess of Ravenscourt. She had found her power, her dignity, her voice. And perhaps, most unexpectedly, she had found a man who saw her, truly saw her, and chose to stay. The marriage of convenience was becoming something far more complicated, something infinitely more precious, something worth protecting with all the fierce determination she'd once reserved for merely surviving. She smiled at Lucian across the table, and he smiled back, a real smile, warm and unguarded. And Isidora Fairchild understood with perfect clarity. She was home. The end. Did you enjoy the story? Then like, subscribe, and help others fall in love with these captivating Victorian-era romance stories, just as you did. Thank you and see you on the next one.